Welcome, students, teachers, alum, friends of the program, and the generally curious to our final episode for the summer-fall season of the Constitution in American Life with the Friends of Publius. As we leave the stage for 2023, and just in case we have one or two new viewers to our program, let us introduce the FOPs for one last time. We have from the great state of North Dakota by way of Indiana, one of the very best civic educators, Professor Chris Kavanaugh. From the Cheese State and the Berkeley of the Midwest, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the Center on the Study of the Constitution is Professor Tim Moore. From the University of San Diego by way of Bakersfield College, political scientist, lawyer, and doctor of comparative politics, Professor James Michael Williams. And I am your host and inquisitor, David Richmond, a former teacher, coach, and state coordinator in the We the People program. In our closing episode, we are going to be discussing Abraham Lincoln, the power of the presidency during the Civil War, and how we balance rights and security in our constitutional republic, in hopes of providing students representing Unit 3 in the We the People program valuable perspective and insights into America's constitutional history. So let's begin our journey of discovery with Professor Tim Moore. Mr. Moore, from a strict reading of the Constitution, how, in your opinion, do the framers deal with war powers, and how flexible are executive powers during a war?
Well, the answer to the first one is I think they on paper, I think they did a pretty decent job given the history and the discussions that took place at Philadelphia. Now, as to how many, what the president's powers are during time of war, that's an entirely different question. But the Congress declares the war, and the president becomes the commander-in-chief after it's been declared. So in a sense, it now becomes his job, and there's a control on funding, a two-year cap on spending for any declared war. There's impeachment control. So there's ways to control the president, again, on paper. So I think on paper, what you have is a pretty decent balance. Both two branches are involved in the war powers, the funding mechanism, and there's like several statements in Article 1, Section 8, all in a row. I think it's maybe 11 through 15. Chris will correct me if I don't have that exactly right. But yeah, there's things that Congress is in charge of. So in some ways, the president on paper has to sit around till Congress acts in terms of declaring war and these war powers. And it's interesting, the presidential role in the Federalist anti-Federalist debate, there was a lot of discussion about, does this, is it a monarchy? Is it a despot? So there's all kinds of anti-Federalist concerns about that. There's an interesting anti-Federalist essay. The pseudonym is Tammany, and he raises an interesting point. He raises the traditional, on paper, this looks like a monarchy, but he also raises the issue of the two-year funding. In England, there was only a one-year cap. There was a one-year cap on funding, and now under this Constitution, it doubles the time. And so there's that in the Tammany piece. Tammany also raises an interesting point about the Quartering Act. He in the essay he calls this Mutiny Act, which I think was the technical description of the Quartering Act in the 1760s. And the argument goes like this: look, if this president's in charge of troops and there's no restriction on housing those troops, eventually we'll get a Third Amendment. But at the time of the ratification, there's no Third Amendment. So Tammany raises an interesting point about the despotic nature of this presidential powers if there's no restriction on quartering troops. So that was a fascinating thing that I noticed. Patrick Henry has a great speech about this despot And again, we'll put all these in the resources at the end. But so when your question asking about the founders, I look at the result on paper and the debates during the ratification debates as to, and I think frankly, the Anti-Federalists, shocking to you guys, I think the Anti-Federalists run out what's on paper and raise some legitimate concerns about what's this going to look like in the future. I mean, now some of it gets a little ridiculous, but like, for example, one essay says, we're suspicious of this 10-mile square federal district. They kind of said that this is going to be a monarchical district, kind of like the royal courts of Europe and all the Society of Cincinnati. These officers are going to be these sycophants for a despotic power. So they speculate, but some of their speculations, I think, do raise some, I know what it says on paper, but let's speculate a little bit about how this.
I mean, I'm happy you did that. I mean, here's what, they said on paper, and I'm gonna, I'll give them, I guess some credit for being, relatively sincere about that. But it does seem like the Anti-Federalists are a little bit, more realistic and more prescient as far as let's play this out. And that's what I always wonder about the Federalists and the whole process. And is time such an issue that it forces them not to look at the long game, or is ratification so significantly they got to have it? So they just, in the last analysis, Federalists aren't going to consider, changes or not ratifying. And the second part of my question kind of harkens back to the district questions. Not the questions these kids are dealing with at this point, but the district questions where, it asks, how have wars and emergencies, expanded presidential power? And I was working with a group of kids this week, and they did the standard thing, and talked about how it has. And my question is, should they? Should wars and emergencies allow for presidential power to expand, especially in written constitutionalism, in which we distinguish ourselves from common law tradition by saying we have specific limitations, effective limitations on the expression of power, which is why I ask you the second part there, Professor Moore, and that is, okay, once we get beyond the written word, to the best of your knowledge, did the framers have a sense that the executive was going to have to play around, especially by the way they articulate powers in Article 2, that there were going to have to be flexibility in these executive powers, especially in war and foreign policy?
I mean, they did talk about prerogatives of the executive, and that's a dangerous discussion, and they have it briefly at Philadelphia. And certainly the Anti-Federalists echo that, and pick up on that and echo those concerns. It's interesting how cautious Washington was with his presidential, quote, war powers. I mean, when you look at, and I would urge students to really look at his behavior in the Whiskey Rebellion. He's very cautious. He marches just, he calls out these troops to go into West Pennsylvania, and it takes him like forever. And every place he goes, there's a parade for Washington. He slows down, so he's not, and he calls out the militias. So everybody's watching the first president. What's he going to do with these vague powers? Because he's very, everybody's very aware of what the Anti-Federalists have been saying about this executive with these powers. So Washington in the Whiskey, his behavior in the Whiskey Rebellion is worth considering if you want to think about how cautious he was. I mean, I believe that his neutrality declaration was also restraint. Now there's a question about the legality of that, and that's a big discussion between Madison and Hamilton on executive power. But Washington is very cautious with what's on paper. Now, unfortunately, in my estimation, it doesn't carry through our history, but it is interesting from the very beginning. We have an executive that's pretty cautious with those powers.
Mike?
Yeah, Tim, can you or someone else remind me, did Congress give permission for Washington to act during the Whiskey Rebellion?
No, because that's not a declaration of war.
Yeah, because I mean, I know this is a lot of presentism. to me, it's such a lack of articulating what happens in war. It seems so quaint now, right? It's based on this huge assumption of the role of Congress. And I was just, looking at Article 2, and correct me if my reading of it is that the president shall become commander-in-chief when these other units are actually called into service, which to me harkens back to Article 1. Like, okay, Congress has to pull the trigger and then you're commander-in-chief. And it's interesting to me, even as you describe how cautious he was, to me, is that going against what the framers intended with this phrase when called into actual service? Did Washington
it's a good question, because there's a federalism issue in there. I mean, the state militias could be called into service, okay, state entities. Okay. And there's some anti-federalist writings about this. They're concerned about, their native sons, their militias in their states now being under the auspices of a federal despot. So there's that in play, and I believe that's a part of why Washington is cautious in that Whiskey Rebellion, because he's relying on state entities as he marches west. And he never even gets out there. He stops about a third of the way west in Pennsylvania and then lets Hamilton take charge. And by the time everybody gets out there, the rebellion's gone. But there's a federalism thing in those military powers in terms of the state militias. You have a federal officer corps, but the most of the pyramid military structure is state militias.
Well, where's the federalism? Are you saying that the states have some authority to limit or reject?
Well, that's what one anti-federalist proposed. He didn't use the word if they're nationalized, but that was the concern, that the state militias would be nationalized and they no longer would be state entities. And then there's this proposal, even in the Hartford Convention in 1815, there's discussion about if troops are called up from the states, would governors still have control over them? And they proposed that in one of their resolves at the Hartford Convention. And that was earlier in some of the anti-federalist writings about.
I thought Article 1, Section 8 gets us around this federalism issue, that it's very clear that if Congress decides they're going to call them up, all right, they now become federalized. There's no federalism issue. The states can't resist.
Well,
that can't interpose themselves.
Well, I think that's a classic, David. I think that's a classic federalist view of it. And I also would say there's a little bit of presentism in there, looking backwards. I mean, back in the day, there's still this notion that they're local state entities.
Okay, Chris.
That reminds me of the discussion about courts, right? The whole issue about courts that we've had on other shows. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I once had a student use Helvidius #1 in a competition, and Madison says in Helvidius #1 that Tim had alluded to with the Hamilton-Madison debate. And Madison's argument was that Congress has the power to commence, conduct, and conclude. They get to declare, they get to fund, and they get to ratify the treaties. And the person that was judging my student, who actually was a serious attorney, said, I would never want to go to war with you as my commander-in-chief. And I was really frustrated because she was quoting Madison. And Madison's belief was this was a legislative power. James Wilson at the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention gives a fantastic speech and said, and trying to qualm the fears of the anti-federalists, that the Constitution is designed that no single man can take us to war. And I think this is important for the students to understand too. There's one thing about going on the offense and going on the defense. In the resources, I'll post a link to something written by Alexander Hamilton in 1801 called the Examination #1, as the quasi-war with France was kind of playing out. And the idea was certainly the president can act if we are attacked. But if we're going to go on the offense, then the Congress needs to be involved. But if we're on the defense, the president can act. So you see this being played out among the founders, both the Federalists and anti-Federalist viewpoint about executive power here. But it's interesting to think about offense versus defense.
Well, and Madison walked the talk. I mean, when we get to the War of 1812, Madison had every legitimate reason to go to war. All right. If we look at impressment by British Navy forces against Americans as an act of war, he could have done that. But no, he goes to Congress. says, you guys, well, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and you decide. So the one thing about Madison, and he was consistent from his theoretical point of view in the Federalist Papers to when he's actual president. There kind of stuff, which I don't know how presentism it is, Tim. It seems to me they were very concerned. All right, about and that, again, I'm sorry, but that language, that written language, I don't know that I don't understand the ambiguity in that article where you say I'm imposing presentism on it. That language, if we're gonna, is so clear about who has the power.
Sure, but there's still
during the debate there might be concerns, but after the ratification, I don't know.
Oh, but
there's
David,
still a lot of state sovereignty thinking that goes on.
I mean, let's go to the nullification crisis that ensues in the 1820s, and so or the idea of Jefferson writing about nullification in the Kentucky Resolution in response to the Alien Sedition Acts. So there's still there's a big contest between states and the national government,
which was not a sincere political position, but a political tactic. I've heard that on this program from one of you who've immersed yourself, that the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are political tactics, not sincere expressions of constitutional philosophy.
Well, whether that may be the case, but there are a lot of people that see it as sincere constitutional theory. To Chris's point in the 20s, and
John C. Calhoun might have been one of those.
Yeah, and he's an interesting switch in time that saves 9-2 on that. But
I think for the students watching and teachers, it's interesting to think about offense versus defense, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure this will come up in the discussion about how Congress can act or not.
Well, let's talk about that, Professor Kavanaugh. I read a lot, and I wish I could access I don't know how to work the technology here, so I'm not going to try because I'll probably lose you guys. But I read an interesting article and some others about Lincoln having been labeled the first American dictator for his actions during the Civil War. What actions did he take that might merit this label, in your opinion, Professor Kavanaugh? And to what extent was he justified in his actions?
Well, I'm not going to do this to you guys and go find a book, but I'm going to mention it. It's Farber. It's called Lincoln's Constitution, and I'll put a link to it, a review to that book in our resources. Fantastic text about Lincoln and how he manipulates the Constitution to a degree. But part of this is also because Congress is not in session. So he calls for troops. He calls for a blockade. He calls for suspending habeas corpus. And all of those are not necessarily within his power as president. So, I mean, I'm not sure that I would go with dictator. I think that he certainly expands.
Well, he suspends the right of representation in Maryland.
Yeah, that's another one.
How's that not dictatorial?
Well,
he's a first. There's a lot of First Amendment problems too. His administration jails a lot of editors that were kind of sympathetic to the South. I mean that was Vladingham.
Vladingham, yeah.
Was that speech case that challenged the shutting down of presses?
Yeah. So there's a long laundry list, but I would refer you to his very famous speech that he gives on July 4, his all laws but one speech, because he gets slapped down by Taney in the ex parte Merriman case over habeas, right? And this is when Taney's riding circuit. This is not a Supreme Court case, but the whole idea this guy Merriman's been arrested. He sues for writ of habeas corpus. And does the president have the power to suspend habeas corpus? And Lincoln doesn't really respond to that until he gives an address on July 4, which is interesting, to Congress, and basically says, are we going to lose all the laws but one? And this is talking about habeas. Taney slaps him down because the suspension of habeas corpus is a congressional power. This is in Article 1, clearly. And Taney legally is probably correct. So Lincoln gives his address to Congress and says, okay, I've done this. Yes. Now, I did this because I'm trying to save the Union. So you guys make it right. And I would go to Locke's retroactive ratification. And actually, it really is very similar to Locke's retroactive ratification in the terms of the prerogative. Can the authority, can the sovereign take action that's outside the law and then go to the parliament or Congress in this case and say, okay, I've done this, now you make it right. Locke tells the story about these row houses. You come upon these row houses, one of them is on fire. All the row houses are going to burn, so there you have to act. It's an emergency. Back to your question, David, about emergency power. So you tear down one or two row houses so the whole row of homes do not get destroyed. Clearly, you've taken an illegal action. Now you go to the local magistrate and say, yes, I took this action. This is why I took this action. I'm asking you to retroactively ratify what I did. And this is what Lincoln is doing in his all laws but one speech. And Congress then suspends habeas. Now, was that dictatorial? Maybe, and all these other actions we mentioned and you guys mentioned, is that dictatorial? Maybe. And,
well, I'd love to know your definition of dictatorial.
Well, he also, if I'm not mistaken, he asks, he goes to Congress on a couple of these and says, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned.
Yeah.
And they give him a pass. So, I mean, I don't know whether that justifies it.
Wait. So can I ask you, who's the they? Congress?
Congress.
Does he have I'm just wondering, this is 1862, what is this, 1862?
Yeah, 63, yeah.
Does he have a tremendous opposition in Congress?
No. Oh, there are peace Democrats. There's not a majority, but there are peace Democrats. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of think it's one party rule, at this point. It changes, but I think at this point there's kind of one party.
My response to that, my response to that would be so.
I don't think here's my problem there, Professor Kavanaugh, is it sets a precedence. To justify Lincoln, to say it's okay, is now wait.
This is where you're wrong. This is where you're wrong. It doesn't set a precedent. It doesn't set a precedent.
Now we incorporate Machiavelli into the American Constitution.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. You're wrong. Because he goes to Congress and said, make it right. If they don't, they don't. And they can Congress can remove that power. They choose not to. And whether the people, his opposition is there or not, he goes for congressional approval. And when he runs for re-election in 1864, he said, you don't like what I did? Don't re-elect me. Yeah. And those other people that left the Union, so how should you have a voice if you're not even there? So I wouldn't say Machiavelli's not going to say that. Niccolo Machiavelli and the Prince does not say that. Dictators don't say that. He goes to Congress and asks for that. Now, is it dictatorial? Maybe.
Yeah, dictators say that their end is righteous, their end is good, that I am doing something to preserve. All right. Yes, of course, dictators say that, Chris. Are you kidding me that they don't say that? They're always presenting that what they are doing is right and righteous and for the good of the larger element there. And that's what Lincoln's doing. Mike,
Dave, dictators don't go to Congress and say, make it right or impeach me. They don't look for that legislative approval. They just do it.
And again, you and I fundamentally disagree on the status of Congress at the time as a counterforce to the president. Yeah, Mike.
So, and again, my response is so.
Mike,
I think I'm leaning with Dave a little bit on this. I think that here's what I think. I think that for me, it's easy to make this argument because I don't think we're a democracy until 1965. So he's just one dictator among many for a lot of the population. But I think if it walks like a duck, it's like. He did things beyond what the Constitution allowed. Now, I think for the students to be thinking about this, there are a couple things come to mind, that it's really important who we choose to exercise this office, because I do agree with Chris that a dictator, the types of dictators I'm thinking about wouldn't even pretend to go to Congress. They would just get rid of Congress, and they wouldn't hold elections in the midst of a civil war. So to me, that shows me that he may have been acting in a dictator manner, but was he a dictator? I think ultimately he thought that he was answerable to the people, but he was acting like a dictator. And I do think you're right, David. It sets a precedent the Confederates fired shots on the Union and declared their separation. That's what Lincoln would say gave him the power. Is it plausible in the current political culture we have in the next 10 to 20 years that some group fires off weapons against the government, and that our president would say, this is the equivalent of what Lincoln went, this is the equivalent of a civil war. So I'm going to assume Lincoln's power and wrap it into this historical example of Lincoln as the righteous leader. Do I see that example as being problematic? Yeah. But I also think it's a little squishy with the elections and with him even going to Congress. It makes it a little squishy.
Yeah.
And after Reconstruction, we have a series of weak presidents. Now during Reconstruction, the South is going to continue to make the Lincoln dictatorship argument with the occupation of the South by Union troops. So they're going to continue that argument that it's the National Reconstruction is another presidential policy of dictatorship. But it's not the first. Political parties use the dictator. The Whigs always accused Jackson of because his overuse of veto, that was dictatorial. They also some New England politicians, most of them Whigs, accused Polk in how we got into the Mexican cession, the war against Mexico. So there's always this rhetoric in the early American time. Even the New England Federalists at the Hartford Convention, Mr. Madison's War. And the Virginia dynasty, borders on a despotic system. So it's not the first time it's been used rhetorically, but I think your point, David, about, well, let's look at the actions. In that time of Lincoln and the Civil War, it's not just rhetoric. These are real constitutional problems, and I've kind of enjoyed listening to you and Chris go back on those.
My question to David and Mike, then, what would you have Lincoln do?
Follow the law. He has to call Congress back into session, because here's the arguments made about wars and emergencies. It's the most common, and the students that I was working with, they give it. The president has to be given latitude to react quickly in certain times. And again, I say, okay, give me an example in history where the president had to act quickly. And they'll say the Civil War. And I said, well, why? He could have called Congress back into session. There's no, immediate crisis for the Union for him to do that without Congress in session. Again, that might be subject. That's obviously subject to debate, but I don't see. Again, that justification that the president has to act quickly, is the most dangerous slippery slope that this country has bought into. Wilson goes down that path. Roosevelt goes down that path. All Cold War presidents go down that path. And again, don't tell me it didn't set precedent. All right. Presidents have gone back to Lincoln and said, he did this, so therefore I'm allowed to do this. So
I know Lincoln, you're no Lincoln.
That's right. Mike?
I agree. I don't disagree with that, David, that he could have waited to go back to Congress. But then we're faced with the same dilemma you pointed out. Who's in Congress at that point? So we might be looking back and saying, well, of course he did that, because it was all of his support was there. What are they going to say? It's not a real Congress, right?
But then I want to know what distinguishes us. Why do we always pat ourselves on the back that we're somehow some kind of shining example, and that our written constitutional system is better than the British common law, which allowed too much flexibility and too much power to be wielded by the sovereign, kind of stuff. But ours has more effective limitations on power. You get to that's a bunch of BS.
Well, do we have to bat 1,000 to be an example? To Chris, I think I'm going to chime in here maybe and defend Chris, which makes me a little nervous.
No, I don't need it. Thanks, though.
Oh,
I guess I misread that.
Well, I wasn't saying. I wasn't justifying what Lincoln was doing.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering whether or not calling him a dictator is actually the right thing to do.
And I think there's a geography issue here. He has the misfortune of being in charge of a government that's surrounded by Maryland. and a Confederate state. So I think, to give Lincoln a little leeway here, because a lot of the newspapers he suppressed were Maryland. The telegraph issues, a lot of that was Maryland. So I think the geography maybe plays into whether we're gracious or not gracious to Lincoln. I mean, that's a real dilemma, and I think the geography plays into that a little bit.
So, Mike, let's get into some comparative perspective here. I'm wondering how other nations deal constitutionally and political with two issues here: the balancing of liberty and security during these times, I guess, of emergencies or threats, and executive war power. Are we again exceptional, unique, an outlier, or is there a pattern there in which we fit into a mold like other nations?
Yeah, no, and I'll put this resource in our notes. There's a website called Constitute, which is a wonderful website that has all the different constitutions of the world there. You can search by different subtopics and kind of see how the United States compares on paper. Right? I'd encourage the students to look on paper first and then delve into actually what happens. And for this question, I was thinking about emergency powers, like not by statute, but in constitutions. What other countries have emergency powers? 90%, 92% of all countries have in their constitution something that says something about what the executive can do during an emergency. It's in Western Europe, the only exception is Sweden and a couple other countries. Canada does not have anything, and we do not have anything. So what this means is that in a constitution such as France, and if we move outside of Europe, a country like Israel that I looked up as well, a country like South Africa, it says very specifically that there will be emergencies, and they define what that emergency could look like. And then they set out in the Constitution, this is what the executive can do. This is the time period. This is who he or she has to consult with. And it puts the parameters on the extent of which that power can be regulated. So I think we are in, we're the exception in terms of established democracies that we don't have that written out in the Constitution. And given our last discussion, I guess it's not surprising given the things that we were doing after the Civil War, but you can imagine, a 16th Amendment that would be like, all right, we really need to lay out what happens during a time of emergency in terms of what we are going to allow presidents to do or not do. And as far as I know, that wasn't even on the table. The other aspect of this I looked at is just like constitutions, who has the power to declare war. And with that, we're kind of in the norm in that it's our executive. Most constitutions have the executive to be like in charge during wars. Different executives are out there though. So for example, in Spain to this day, it's the King of Spain. If there's a declaration of war, that becomes the commander in chief and that is in charge of it, not the president or prime minister of Spain, which is interesting.
Old school.
Yeah, very old school.
Well, are you talking about commander in chief powers or declaring the war itself?
No. Well, it depends. We could look at different things. In Spain, the king has the power to declare war as well. And
wow.
Yeah.
Well, in England, technically, the head of parliament goes to the monarch and says, we'd like to go to war,
yeah.
And the monarch kind of signs off on it. So so you're saying in most countries, the executive, has the power to declare war? Or
in most countries, it's the power. It's a joint power between the legislature or the executive, but the commander in chief. I couldn't find any countries where the commander in chief is someone other than an executive. And the final thing I'll just mention, because it's in the news, right? Israel, the government invoked this emergency power for Israel right now. That's what gave Netanyahu the power to form this unity government. And it's allowing him to allowing the government to do certain censorship that is not considered illegal right now because this act was, or this provision was used.
For students in an emergency power, I would direct you to Justice Jackson's concurrence in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. He's got it's not the controlling opinion, but it's the one we know about the zone of twilight of executive power, right? When the Constitution speaks or the Congress speaks and gives that power to the president, that's when his power is at its highest. When the Congress has spoken against extending the power, or the Constitution forbids it, that's when his power is at the lowest. But when the Congress is silent and the Constitution is silent, then the president's power is then in the zone of twilight. It's become known as the twilight zone of executive power. And he also talks about the idea of emergency. So if you grant the idea that the president has this emergency power, this inherent power that Truman was arguing for with the backdrop against the Korean War, then guess what? The president's always going to be finding emergencies.
Exactly.
So,
no, and I think it's telling that it's the Supreme Court that's kind of filling in this for us rather than the Constitution. I mean, just another quick story. I remember the day of the September 11th attacks. I believe it was a Tuesday. I would be wrong on that. Anyways, I came to campus after that morning, and we were all just in the hallways kind of stunned. And a colleague of mine who was German on our staff, who's from Germany, but he was teaching for us, he immediately came to me and he said, "So what does the US Constitution say? Like, what's the emergency powers right now? What can the government do?" And I said, there's nothing in the Constitution. There's some statutes, but there's nothing in the Constitution. And he found that remarkable. He's like, "You mean anything could happen right now in terms of the Constitution?" And I was like, yeah, that's what we're set up for.
Yeah. So, Professor Moore, we kind of referenced this, and and that is this notion of precedence, and does Lincoln become a role model for presidents who follow in his footsteps, or is it more accurate or apt to say that for the modern presidency, Wilson provides a greater sense of precedence for executive powers during wars and emergencies?
Well, I think, well, you've obviously come out pretty strong on it becomes a precedent / excuse for modern Lincoln does. Even during Wilson, there was a Sedition Act during World War I as well. It's interesting to me that in the very first Sedition Act in the 1790s, 98, you couldn't speak against the president, and actually, editors were jailed. And so there's a very similar set of provisions in the Second Sedition Act in World War I. In presidential power to control the economy, the War Industries Board. Students might want to look that up. That had control in their fingers in large parts of the economy. And I think that in part may have influenced Truman to do what he did in Youngstown, the precedent of a War Industries Board overseeing the economy on a wartime footing. So I don't know whether, I think if you want to make a really expansive, it seems to me, and you're asking the guy that's uncomfortable with everything after 1800, but I think if you really want an expansive view, you go to Lincoln. You really do. Because I think a lot of the precedent that's set there seems to be because it's Lincoln's a lot more palatable, righteous, than Wilson is in his wartime efforts. So I think Lincoln's gravitas in history and the way we perceive him gives him he's a precedent or / excuse, as you've stated.
Well, and I think you've articulated that well, and a lot of that Wilson does is, again, the Sedition Act, that's passed by Congress. And I'm assuming, I can't remember the sequence, I'm assuming the War Industries, the economic is also passed by Congress.
Yep.
Am I accurate on that? but Wilson, especially
Well, it
with
might have been executive. I don't know. It probably was, but it might have been executive fiat, executive order. I don't know.
Same thing is true with the Committee on Public Information led by George Creel.
Yep,
Bernard
yep.
Baruch is the guy that leads the WIB, and Creel
Yep.
leads the CPI. So he creates these agencies. I think what's interesting about Wilson is the fact that when he runs for re-election, his slogan is he keeps us out of war. Boom, he gets reelected, and what do you know? We're in war. And the push from that, there's no difference. I mean, the change in terms of harassment of shipping hasn't changed that it did prior to the election. So the political nature of it, and then when you see that blowback by people, which leads to some very, very famous case law coming out of World War I, as well as the creation of the ACLU coming out of World War I. I think it's interesting to think about for the students maybe to examine how does Wilson go from campaigning on he kept us out of war to he gets reelected, and now he's asking Congress for this declaration of war in World War I. So I think they're the political undertones, but there's a great Ken Burns series on this, and the number of people that are arrested for just speaking on a train about things. Obviously, we get some very, very famous case law coming out of World War I in response to the Sedition Act that Tim talks about, right? Or the Espionage Act comes out.
Right, yeah,
too.
right.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris. That's where I think my things about Wilson are both before the war and then after the war. One, you just said it. To what extent does he steer us? I'm sorry, but does he steer us after promising in 1916 that I'll keep the boys out of war? But then he seems to steer us in that direction. That's one interpretation. But then it's after the war, and his singleness, his idea that he must be over in Europe, and he's got to negotiate this. And the first president to leave the continent and take this commander-in-chief and negotiator of treaties into presidential power seems to me to establish kind of this precedence of the executive office having total control of foreign policy is both before and after.
I kind of see the 14 points as a piece of progressivism more so than a power play of executive power. I think historians differ on was Versailles his opportunity to go global with progressivism, or was it a power move to strengthen the American presidency through foreign policy? So I think both. I'm sorry.
Can it be both?
I'm just laying out the argument. There's another way to look at it historically. You laid out the argument. It's a power play for executive power.
Well, I'm struck by the way Wilson uses these acts that were passed in the fog because of the war to his own political advantage. I mean, we have some Americans who will chant "lock them up." He locked him up, right? Eugene Debs goes to prison. That's his main rival, and the way he used these things against what he saw as his political rivals in labor, in some ways. I don't know. I mean, this is maybe a bit of a stretch. I see Lincoln trying to preserve the Union, and I don't see him taking the same kind of political advantage. Like, Lincoln did not have a rival locked up before an election, I don't think, right? I don't know. I see
his rival was the general of the Union Army.
Exactly. So I don't know. I mean, David, this goes to you over a year ago, you recommended to all of us and maybe on this program, America at Midnight. That book really opened my eyes to what was happening during this period, of which if I learned it in a class, I must have forgotten it. So we'll be sure to put that book in the show notes. It really does demonstrate what can happen when a president gets power because of an overseas war, and then how that can have ramifications domestically after the war.
I wonder whether Wilson had the luxury of a larger administrative state.
Oh, yeah.
And whether so all that to say is he does deserve to be in the discussion, because Lincoln doesn't have all those agencies at his disposal the way Wilson, because Wilson's coming in at the tail end of the progressive era, where there's all kinds of regulatory entities. So there's an administrative apparatus that Wilson has to do some of these policies. So I just wonder whether that plays into the discussion, whether, Wilson's the champion of executive abuse.
Yeah. There's this really interesting political science book. I can't believe I just said that. It's by this anyways, it's about presidential power, and that's the argument the author makes in terms of the thickness of the administrative branch. He argues on two things: that how the executive can become much more despotic, but then also how it's really hard for presidents to make change because they're surrounded by this huge administrative state where they put out an order and no one's going to listen to them, right? It was much easier when you just had the few people around.
Man, I feel kind of dirty now that I'm thinking in a political science sense. I don't know.
I know.
I'm a little nervous.
Need a shower?
Maybe.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, we've all heard the phrase that the first casualty of war is truth. And it seems that a link to that is the primary victim of war, at least in U.S. history, is the First Amendment. Would you agree with me? Is that an accurate description of kind of constitutional history and emergency powers? Is that the First Amendment in many ways becomes the great victim?
It's hard to disagree with that for sure, David, because starting with the Alien and Sedition Acts, when it's not even a war.
I wasn't even thinking about that. Good, thank you.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I'm going to put a link to a really great book that deals exactly with that question, David, in our resources. Is called Perilous Times: Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act to the War on Terror, and it's by Professor Jeffrey Stone. Fantastic text, and it starts, with the Jeffersonian Republican editors getting locked up, and actually one's a member of Congress and gets locked up. So from there forward, and the cases I just mentioned, like Schenck and Michael mentioned Debs coming out of World War I, thinking about Lincoln again, back to our boy Lincoln and the Civil War and what he does in terms of shutting down opposition newspapers. So yeah, absolutely.
Pentagon paper case too.
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah. Holy smokes. I mean, our history is rife with examples of people's First Amendment rights getting shut down. Well, there's the argument to be made that actually this is when they really need to be most protected. And you think about what happens with Schenck and Debs and a couple of other cases coming out of World War I as well, because of the Espionage Act. You fast forward to some cases in World War II.
I was going to ask you, Chris, could you make the argument that Gobitis falls under that umbrella? That the argument in Gobitis is we're on the eve of war and patriotism is important, and we can't have these darn kids not saluting the flag.
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I'm not really sure. I never really considered that angle, but
Frankfurter's decision is all wrapped up in the flag and patriotism.
Oh, yeah. Well, no doubt. And he says, I'm the first and only Jewish member of the court. So if anybody knows, persecution, it's me. But yet, as you said, we all need to stand and salute the flag. So, and of course, that changes just a couple years later with some members of the court changing, as well as Jackson coming on the court in West Virginia v. Barnett in 43. So it's interesting. In 40, perhaps, yes. But in 43, with Barnett, West Virginia v. Barnett students, great language in Justice Jackson's opinion in that, that we can't dictate patriotism, no matter what some may be saying right now.
Right, and I'll need to find it and see if I can put it in the sources. A great source that argues that timing is all important here. That by 43, who are we fighting and how do we distinguish ourselves? Right. All right, especially in issues about religious minorities.
I think that, and I think Mike usually does a good job, but we've done this in the past on multiple programs, is we have to consider the culture and the time frame. So for the students watching, when we talk about these ideas, and as you just said, David, 1940, or we're not necessarily fighting anybody. 43, we are fighting for sure. We are engaged directly in the war. So, for the students, what is happening in history? What's the context? What is the culture? What is happening on the outside of maybe the courts and the Congress and the attitude at the time. So that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, students might want to look into the amount of Jehovah's Witness kids that got beat up after the first decision. I mean, so that I think the court was really naive on the cultural backlash that, in a sense, kind of declared open season on Adventist. I forget whether Adventist or whether they were
Jehovah's
Witness. So to Chris's point about there's some cultural things going on where the court can have their come to Jesus moment and say, well, maybe there's this matter of law, but there's also all this crap going on that people are getting beat up badly.
Tim, did you just say the court might be naive?
Yes, I did, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Yes.
Well, and I think it's important to note this is not something that's, that we have to go back in history. We're having this debate right now. Now, true, it probably isn't the United States government, but it's definitely universities and government entities. And it's like the state of Florida and other states, which are now banning certain groups from being able to associate and organize because of their politics, and just reinforcing. It's shocking to me, and again, just showing how naive I am, it's shocking to me in the year 2023, we're trying to shut people's mouths on university campuses. And it's interesting, it's going both ways. Whether they're pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, you have different and maybe it's just, a bad place to be an administrator, a college administrator, is how do you deal with this? And maybe the University of Chicago rules should prevail, is just shut your mouth. Don't take a stand on any of this stuff, kind of thing. Mike, as a university professor, you might have some insights on this. Does it surprise you at all what's happening around the nation? And it's not our war necessarily. Maybe it is, and maybe that's part of the debate. But the attempts and the actions to try to shut people up here is it's just shocking to me.
It doesn't surprise me because it seems like this has been a slow creep now for a couple decades. And I also think that for a lot of our students, our 18 to 22-year-olds or whatever on campuses, the argument that you're at a university, this is the place to explore ideas, and we should be able to say what we want as long as we're not inciting violence type of stuff. The overwhelming reaction from those students are, well, I came to your university because you say you have a mission. You say you're promoting something in addition to the sharing ideas. And in the case of institutions like the one I work at, that mission has to do with this language of social justice, human dignity, right? And so I think you said it, administrators are, once a university puts itself out that it has a mission it's advancing, administrators are really then put in a difficult situation, because what if you have folks who want to say something on campus that are in contradiction to your mission, the mission in addition to free flow of ideas. So, and then there's the role that, that donors and other people of interest are playing at universities that make it really difficult. We're dealing with this. Yeah, all campuses are dealing with this right now, and it's. I don't think it's new, and it's not surprising, and I don't think, much like I was just complaining, like after the Civil War, something should have been done to set up a rule how we're going to deal with this. It seems like you move from side of one crisis to another, and it's the same issues that bubble up.
This probably isn't out of the ordinary for the University of Wisconsin, right, Tim? I mean, they're protesting something all the time. I think
we're reconfiguring the Wisconsin ideal to be protest something today.
You guys like spin a wheel?
In sociology, they probably have a sub minor in that. I don't know. I mean, it's quite festive here on a daily basis on the Memorial Plaza.
Yeah. So, but it is important, kids, that you may be asked that on this question as far as First Amendment issues. So, Mike, it seems, one of the things the kids have to deal with is this notion of guardrails during wars and emergencies. And it seems to me that Congress attempted. They tried to create a stronger guardrail on executive war power back in 1973 with the War Powers Act. So I'm curious. See, Professor Moore's already laughing, and I haven't even finished the question.
Well,
Yet.
no, I'm sorry.
But do you believe this Act 1 is constitutional based upon your understanding and your reading? And to what extent do you feel it has been effective, if at all?
I'll take the second question for $100, Dave. Now, I think the evidence is it has not been effective. And students, we probably don't have the time, and I don't have the expertise to give you all the details of the War Powers Act, but Congress in the Constitution has the right to declare war, and this act to me seems like it's an act that says we really mean it. We really mean it, President. You have to consult with us. So the War Powers Act kind of tries to say, like, after the Vietnam experience, I think is what is on people's minds. They say, look, okay, presidents are going to have to act, but if you act, you have to come to us in 48 hours, and then you have to come back to us, and we have to approve anything after 60 days, and there's all this kind of stuff. Have presidents since then, some presidents have said it's unconstitutional and just not used it. Other presidents have said, I'm taking this power, I'm doing this because of the War Powers Act, but they don't follow the guidelines and actually go to Congress and get permission. Congress has done things to just aid presidents by, writing very vague authorizations to use military force, which can be used then for apparently many other conflicts after the one it was written for. So it hasn't been effective. Whether it's constitutional, there are some resources I can provide. I would say that the legal community is split on whether it's constitutional or not.
Well, can I ask you, do you think it expands or inhibits presidential power? Well,
Yeah.
I mean, this was a student said this to me, and I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah.
But they said it sanctions the president to act unilaterally. So therefore, it does expand presidential power.
I think that there's a strong argument for that. I mean, President Obama in 2011, right? Bombing of Libya. He said, look, there's this act that kind of says I can do this, but this act really isn't a full-scale invasion. So I'm going to invoke the act, but I'm not going to go to Congress because it gets all slippery. And I think what the American public hears is War Powers Act, and a Congress saying they have the power to do this. And to the extent that the American people actually think about this and worry about this and focus on it, which is another issue for the students to think about, because I think that's the biggest check there is on this. But yeah, I think that student's making a strong point. It just enhances power.
I like Mike's framing of war powers as, and we really mean it. I'm going to propose another way to think about War Powers Act. We really effed up with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Yeah.
So I would urge students to not just look at War Powers Act, and I think it's important to look at that. I mean, so I'm glad you raised it, David, because this is really important. But you can't. I see this as the pendulum. They gave Johnson almost a blank check in Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and 10 years later, it's like, oops, our bad. So. And whether they really meant war powers or not, I have my cynicism about that, because they've not really been aggressive with that law when presidents have gone to war. So I think it was our bad. Shouldn't have done Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Yeah.
Well, partly too, because you have a different president as well.
Yep.
Right. But also, I think, I laughed a little bit, David, about with the student's question, because I think so much of it depends on which way your twig is bent, because liberals are going to say it's giving the president power that he doesn't have, and conservatives are going to say it's constraining the president in ways it shouldn't. And most presidents really don't give a shit guard, and they're going to do whatever they want to do, and they'll challenge. In the modern sense, they're going to challenge Congress to do it anyway. And I think it was George H.W. Bush in the first Gulf War who famously said, "I don't need some old goat in Congress's approval to take this action." So much of it just depends on and it's interesting, Mike, that you brought up Obama, because there was only one guy in Congress was saying, hey, the president can't do this. The president can't do this. And it was Dennis Kucinich, a liberal from Ohio, is saying, hey, the president can't do this. And everybody's like, Dennis, go away.
Well, and the flip side of that, the students, another just sort of example is that, during the Syrian sort of conflict, President Obama did not want to carry the load of like making that decision. And so you should look into that, because the president actually said, Congress, this is your duty. You tell me to do this and I'll do it, but I need you. We need to be in this together. And Congress, I forget whether they even voted on it. I don't know if they
did not take any action to extend what they had done, because he was still operating under the authorization for the use of military force that President Bush was using.
Right.
And that was his justification for things. And you're exactly right, Michael. He goes to Congress and say, hey, I need to do this stuff, but I would like to have some constitutional cover here, because I used to teach this stuff in law school, and this is not right. And Congress like, do what you want.
Yeah. So he's kind of like Lincoln, huh?
Yeah. Well, and Mike, I'm glad you brought up kind of public opinion and the people's response, because generally they don't really give a dang about foreign policy and don't pay attention. And my general reading of history is, we're all, we tend to get all rah, rah, rah about a war, as long as it's an easy one like Grenada that we can win in about 3 months. But we run out of patience fairly quickly. I think George W. Bush learned that. Going, and maybe George Herbert Walker Bush, not so much, but going from 85% public opinion, yay ratings at the beginning, but then by the time in 2004, suddenly the public's turned sour on them. I don't think Americans, generally understand these issues, nor do they have patience for actual military conflict. Yeah, Chris.
Two things to consider, David, and to dovetail with what you're saying. If we had a draft, things may change. And the other thing, I keep thinking, this really sticks to my craw, and my students, we were watching this, and in the 2016 campaign, they had a commander-in-chief, like a press event on an aircraft carrier, right? So they brought in candidate Trump, and then they brought in candidate Clinton, and it was called Commander-in-Chief, and what would you do as Commander-in-Chief stuff, right? And my students were like, wait a minute, they're not going to be commander-in-chief till the Congress does the calling, but Congress was never even brought up in this discussion, right? This campaign event. So we moved so far away from the first principles of the Constitution in terms of what's in the document, David, as where you started us with, right? The very beginning of the discussion. You're right. The public doesn't know and they don't care. So the fact that we're talking to these candidates about, oh, well, what would you do as commander-in-chief? And no one said, well, first of all, Congress has to make me commander-in-chief because they've got to call these folks into service. We don't. It just.
And I think that's probably the greatest guardrail we could have. And that is to go back to a draft. Because if every American family's son or daughter has the potential to have to serve, suddenly I think executive leaders and Congress are going to be a lot more reticent in getting us involved in places maybe we shouldn't be getting involved in. Well, unfortunately, time has come to an end here for our ability to continue this conversation. And so as we do, I'll ask each of our wonderful scholars to provide final insights, thoughts, recommendations to our students and teachers. So, Professor Williams.
Yeah. I think that I think you should go back and if you've gotten to the end, congratulations. That's going to be a wrap. But the discussion between Dave and Chris, I think, is the part of this discussion that you should go back and really think about.
Yep.
it's one of the questions I quite frankly have been thinking about since has been in college, and it's a simple way to phrase it. Do the means justify the ends? And if that is going to be your universal kind of framework for how you move through the world or how you see government decisions, are you going to be happy with all the means that are taken to get you to that end? And that's really what the question, like when you think about presidential power in Lincoln, for example, maybe there it's easier for you to justify the ends and the means that were used. But if that's the practice, then are you going to be just as happy, I don't know, with Wilson or with Bush or with Trump or with Obama, or with whoever? I don't think we have the luxury to pick and choose that framework. I think you kind of have to have it. You have to move through the world with, are the ends going to justify the means, or do the means need to justify the ends? So I would leave with that kind of meta thought.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Yes, and I want to clarify. My pushback was I'm not sure that I would call Lincoln a dictator. That's my pushback. I'm not justifying Lincoln's actions. I think the history is our history.
You couldn't let it go. You couldn't let it go.
I could not. I just can't. I mean, you look up stubborn in the dictionary, you may see my picture, students. Are obstinate, depending on who you talk to. I think for the students, our history is rife with these examples as we've been throwing out. My gosh, we've just walked you through a couple of 100 years of history from the founding to almost modern times. And I think this is always true. And this is true for everything. When the government takes action, where within the four corners of the document do they get the power? And if you think about how there's a finite amount of power divided in the Constitution between these branches of power, what has happened over time to expand this executive power and reduce legislative power? Is the legislative power have they voluntarily given this power to the president? Have they abdicated this power, or has the executive usurped this power? And I think this whole area of discussion that Dave has led us on is a fantastic discussion about what has happened within the four corners of the document over time, and how the executive power has expanded, legislative power has receded, and the public, as we just got done talking about, the public, they're not all that concerned. So think about all the examples in history that you can use to illustrate your points.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I have nothing substantive to add, but I'm struck by our discussion because I've discovered today that Chris Kavanaugh is a textualist, or Dave Richmond is a textualist on this issue. I mean, it's and I know you guys well enough to know that all of us kind of rumble around with this idea. There's the big C, little C Constitution. There's the text, and then there's a lot of white space that's filled in as we go down the road of history. So, students, what you've experienced is a discussion about constitutionalism. Is the text important? If so, how much importance does it have? Or does it evolve over time? And I think this discussion, is a wonderful example of, going to the text. What does the text say? And looking at it strictly about powers, and do they stay within branches? Do they float around? Do they expand? So I'm struck by the kinds of reasoning that we've done this last hour. And I just find that fascinating, that in this evolving system that we have, we occasionally drop into the text and want the text to be binding. So that has nothing. I just enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I don't, students, what all the other guys said. Listen to them.
Well, that has made my day to know that we can have a conversation beyond 1800 that captures your attention for an entire hour. So we have completed our 18th and final episode of our summer fall series of the Constitution of American Life. We would like to thank all of our viewers, especially the students and teachers, participating in the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution program. We do hope that we have been of some assistance as you prepare for your regional and state competitions, and do encourage you to let us know if you have any specific recommendations. I'm sure that most of you can find a way to contact at least one of us in this modern Orwellian state that we live in. I would like to leave all the students with a final thought. We the People is true civic education. Good civic education possesses three components: civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions. Hopefully, as you are going through the process of preparing for your events, you can feel and sense your growth in all three areas. I read today a very disturbing article about the adoption of new civic standards in the states of Florida, Virginia, and South Dakota, which will emphasize patriotism, Christianity, and anti-communism, which in all honesty made me chuckle, but will discourage discussion and debate over current events. Florida discourages what has been labeled hands-on lessons, which would encourage students to problem solve and critical think. And in South Dakota, they go so far as to warn teachers against discussing current events. I believe these states are pushing the knowledge leg of civic education, might also call it indoctrination, but they are not doing good civic education because they're absolutely ignoring the skills and disposition components of good civic education. I do encourage all of you to remember that the We the People program is an educational program with the goals of encouraging lifelong learning. The competitive events are a means to an end, not an end unto themselves. Once your participation in this program comes to an end, I do hope you continue your journey towards helping this country achieve a more perfect union by continuing to study, engage, debate, and discuss, as well as ask the tough questions that are demanded of all good citizens. Gentlemen, anything to add as we say sayonara for this season?
I'd say bravo, bravo, bravo.
Well said.
Well said, David.
And
Well, students and teachers,
thank you for your leadership on this, bud.
The bus driver.
Yeah. Well, I leave students, teachers, I leave you with the words from two very important influences in my life, Monty Python and the 70s duo of Seals and Crofts. Remember, always look on the bright side of life, and that we may never pass this way again. Peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
All right.